Just heard a great presentation about weird, and Steffi just said before that this is not a business conference, and now we need to talk about money, about investments. So why are we doing it? Why are we talking about, and why am I doing it? Why are we talking about money and investments? So I'm being asked that question once in a while. So I tell people the story about Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein, after he passed away, he stands in the gates of heaven and greeting the people who are coming. And the first guy comes in, so Einstein asks him, tell me, what is your IQ? And he says, 180. So Einstein tells him, that's very good because we can continue to explore and develop the relativity theory. So the next guy comes in, he says, what's your IQ? Albert Einstein asks him, he says, I'm 140. So Einstein said, that's also cool because we're going to talk about culture and philosophy and all those issues that we're talking about here. Then the last guy comes in, what's your IQ? He said 70. So Einstein asked him, tell me, what is the market doing today? So this is the panel, guys. Okay, so before we start, let's just, a way of introduction, each one of you just let us know which asset class he deals with most of his time, please.
Howard Morgan, first round capital, early stage venture most of the time.
David Tisch, BoxGroup. I'm a professional angel investor.
David Hirsch, Metamorphic Ventures, early stage investing as well.
Jason Schwartz. By day, I work in real estate investment, but I'm here by virtue of my involvement with Israel bonds.
Okay, so just before we went on stage, Steffi told me, be provocative. And I said, well, I plan to be provocative only in the second half of the session. But she says, be provocative. So let's start being provocative, guys. We are in the midst of the biggest bubble ever. And I'm not talking about tech bubble or internet bubble. I'm talking about 7 years of zero real interest rates around the world. I'm talking about a period of time that we never had, and we know that this can be very long because of what's happening in the monetary world around the world. This can still continue for a very long time. So before we start, let's talk about a crazy world where interest rate is zero everywhere, and everybody's chasing returns all over the world in all your asset classes. Please.
Me?
Don't be shy.
Well, first of all, I was nervous when I saw that we were talking about interest rates. I thought interest was Facebook likes at first, but then I realized Howard was on the panel and we'd be okay. As far as interest rates in my world is concerned, and as far as early stage investing, the way I think I see it day to day is because of, I guess, low yield and fixed income, there's a ton of capital on the sidelines. And if you believe in technology long term, and you believe in the disruption, innovation, transformation, I think it's sort of motivated a lot of investors and sort of family offices and other folks to actually take more risk with early stage opportunities, because even the public technology opportunities weren't yielding sort of the returns that people were used to. So I think low interest rates actually has helped fuel some of the capitalization in early stage from moving capital to this asset class.
Howard.
I think what we've seen is zero interest rates if you're a gigantic, very stable operation. But if you're a small business that wants money, it's hardly zero interest rates. It's credit card rates and horrible rates. We now have 7 investments at first round in things that are changing the rate picture, that are letting people who can't borrow. So On Deck Capital here in New York, which has just done a fundraise at a very, very high price because they're doing really well. Fundera, Lending Home, all of these things like Lending Club that are disintermediating the banks and changing the environment so that people can take advantage of those low interest rates. Because for some of us who have capital, we want to earn more, so we're unhappy about the low rates. But for people who are borrowing, it isn't so low. And there's a lot of opportunity in helping them.
We'll soon talk more about the disruption of the financial world. David, please.
Yeah, as David said, I think it has a macro effect. I think you're seeing more investors, you're seeing different people look for risk in different places. On a micro level, on a day-to-day basis, the companies that we work with, it's a company-to-company relationship, and I don't think interest rates plays any role in a specific company's valuation. I think in the past 2 months, I've done deals at $3 million pre-money valuation and $15 million pre-money valuation. It's back to the core things that I think early stage investors are looking at. It's team, market opportunity, product idea, and sort of product founder fit. Those are what's, to me, impacting valuation more than it is a macroeconomic factor.
Jason, you were selling bonds like crazy because of the low interest rate, right?
It's true, and I think that also this encourages people to align their investments with their values. When you're not just looking for the spread, you're also able to look and see where you can have a social impact.
Okay, so Howard, you started talking about disruption of finance. So if we look like 10 or 15 years ago when the internet started really penetrating everywhere, we talked a lot about how the internet, digital world can really disrupt the financial world. But then 15 years went by. We had 2 huge financial crises. The banks in the United States are more than ever too big to fail. The kind of fees we are paying for asset management or anything are still exuberantly high. Nothing hasn't happened. Where is the promise? When are you going to disrupt the financial world, which is eating close to 10% of the GDP? This is crazy. 30 years ago, we were eating 5% of the GDP. Now we're eating 10.
It is crazy. We started in the consumer space with Mint.com to try to give people control of their finances. And of course, the giant Intuit, wonderful giant, but it's gobbled that up. More recently, we had a company called Simple, which was also disrupting consumer banking, gobbled up by BBVA recently. Where we are disrupting mostly is on the lending side. That's where the banks and the credit card companies no longer have the monopoly.
This is still, correct me if I'm wrong, very, very on the margins, on the fringes. We don't see an attack on the financial system that really disrupts this huge behemoth.
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin's going to be.
Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and that's what's going to disrupt it. It disrupts the payment industry. Instead of paying 2.5%, you transfer the Bitcoin for fractions of a percent.
Okay, any other ideas on that?
You know, I think it's all about transparency, really, is really the bigger picture theme. And even Michael Lewis's last book that just came out, it's about sort of transparency. And you're seeing some of the attributes even of financial transparency, even relay into some of the stuff that we do in investing around programmatic buying has some of the same metrics as sort of, transparency. You know, we led the seed investment of Indiegogo, which, Indiegogo is trying to democratize sort of fundraising. And that falls into sort of disrupting financial services. I think a bigger picture conversation is like Chase Bank has 6,000 branches, right? What are they going to do with those branches in the next 10 years? Is that going to define that financial services institution? I don't know.
But is it really a question of transparency? I think that by now, all of us know that we are being ripped off. We just don't know what to do about that. Anybody here in the audience can tell me how much he knows how much fees he's paying on his 401k or in his IRA, on his asset management? Raise his hand. You can read it somewhere in the details, in the fine print, but look at the people.
I think it's education, and education takes a crazy amount of money. And so I think the startups that are attacking this space are significantly underfunded for the long term, right? And so in order to change the consumer behavior and consumer understanding of the finance system, it's going to take a company to come out and actually educate the market as to what matters, as to what you should pay attention to. And I just don't think we've seen a company get to that scale where they're able to put TV commercials after the 7 bank commercials that we see, or put things into the market in a way that normal consumers can understand what the options are.
If you want to, Howard, if you want to disrupt finance, any asset class in finance, how easy it for you to raise big money for that if you want to disrupt the industries you're raising money from?
It's actually pretty easy because there's enough outsider money, which is to say the early stage people who are not beholden, and there's now the crowdfunding world. So you can't raise big money in crowdfunding, you can raise small money, you can raise moderate money in the venture world, and then as the disruption starts, you have to make the choice.
Okay, let's talk about crowdfunding more for a moment. How big is it going to be? How significant is it going to be, you think?
I don't know.
That's a good answer.
It's a good
frank answer.
it's a good question. You know, crowdfunding for us wasn't as simple as sort of, you know, we saw the hotel tonight speak, and you talk about Uber. Howard was an investor in early Uber, where you could actually back into a market. So it's a $50 billion global transportation industry. If we disrupt by X, it could be X. And then there's all these ancillary businesses like delivery. With crowdfunding, it's a new platform to sort of democratize fundraising, whether it be causes or health or content, and we think it's going to be huge.
Uber and Lyft are a good, just a second, David. Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, by the way, are a very good example because those are really companies that want to introduce disruption to a huge market. And what do we see? We see the incumbents trying to kill it through regulation, pursuing politicians and regulators to kill those. So whenever you see this kind of behavior, you know you're hitting something big.
Yeah, definitely. I think Albert this morning, though, showed that you have these new crowdfunding that can raise a lot of money. So that can get you capital in advance of product. The Kickstarter campaigns that are raising 3 million, 8 million, and 10 million for some, that is a really significant change. I mean, the only one who ever did this before in a significant way was Dell. Michael Dell, back when he started his company, said, "You pay me for the computer." He had negative working capital, right? The Kickstarter, Indiegogo are starting to create negative working capital businesses, and that is a very big disruption. But you're right. Certainly with Uber, we've seen that in city after city. You go in and regulation is used, and the mantra is consumer safety, right? And somebody in New York State, they're worrying about Airbnb right now, and I think somebody tweeted, please protect me from the hotel industry. I need protection from them more than I do from the Airbnb hosts.
David?
No, I was going to say crowdfunding's a horizontal thing to me, right? And so there's crowdfunding of equity in companies, there's crowdfunding of ideas and art and projects, there's crowdfunding of hardware products that you're paying in advance for prepay. And I think that each of these categories is going to evolve very differently, right? Do I think that crowdfunding of early stage startups is going to eliminate the professional early stage investor from a selfish purpose? No. But I really don't. I don't think you're going to see repeat entrepreneurs who have relationships with people who they've worked with before go to the crowd for their next company. I do think that in every way that companies raise early stage money, there's going to be winners. And so the first winner that comes from a crowdfunding equity platform is going to send a big wave through the community that says you can build a huge company through this method.
I'll just add that I think crowdfunding is just a natural extension to crowdsourcing, which is sort of leveraging audience for anything. So I look at crowdfunding bigger picture as just old school music A&R. There was a function in A&R, which was basically these guys went out to clubs and tried to find the best content and bands and feeling. And now crowdfunding horizontally is A&R for everything. It's really helps with R&D for product, for content, for companies, and I think it's a feeder into everything eventually, and I do think it's not a winner-take-all, and I think it's huge, and it's proven to be a big business.
And by the way, these things come together. So we have a company called Upstart in our portfolio, which lets you crowdfund students in school for giving them loans where the credit risk is based on their future earnings. On the fact that we know that they're going to, if they get a degree from a major institution, they're likely to be able to be good earners.
If you mention student loans, I have to ask you what's going to happen to the $1 trillion industry of people who are taking loans and investing them in something that there is diminishing return.
Well, the student loan business in the U.S. is obviously got big problems. And the debt load that we place on people when they graduate is really, really awful. And part of Upstart's goal is to fix some of that by capping what people will have to give as a percentage of their income on the way as they get out of those loans. So I think that there is disruption getting ready to hit that market.
Okay, so Jason, you have a product that is more complicated. You are not selling only interest rates and yields and promise for exits. You're selling a product that has another aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier the idea of socially responsible investments. I see Israel bonds as kind of one of the first socially responsible investments when David Ben-Gurion introduced it to the Jewish community in America in 1950. And since then, we've obviously moved forward dramatically, and it's also become a real investment tool. Israel's proven over the last 60-something years that it always has repaid every payment of principal and interest. And I think that as we move into the future, people want to get a return on their philanthropy, but they also expect it to be aligned with their values. And so Israel bonds is one way they've done that. They've moved into the future when it comes to e-commerce sites and that type of thing as well.
Are socially responsible investment is going to be a significant asset class in your various asset class? Do you see any future to those ideas?
I think eventually it becomes table stakes. Like there's a lot of good ideas, there's a lot of good people out there, there's a lot of good companies, a lot of good investments, and I think everyone, if all things are equal, we're proving if things aren't equal, people will pay up for social causes, and when that gets level and things don't cost more, sometimes it's been harder sometimes to participate in social cause. I had a smoothie this morning at Juice Generation, it's at Equinox, and they have this sign on their on their wall. It says 1% of their profits go to making the world better. And whether it's true or not, I felt better about buying my smoothie there. So I think yes.
Okay, yes, Howard, please.
No, I mean, socially responsible is kind of hard to define, right? Should we invest in the marijuana world now that's in Colorado? Is that socially responsible? Some group says it is because it's freeing something that's and other groups say, well, it's not. It's smoking. It's addictive substances. So I think that over time those definitions change. But for what we're trying to do, we prefer not to invest in things that have a taint to them. So we don't do them. But we don't think of ourselves as, quote, socially responsible investors. We just try to avoid being socially irresponsible.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing is that you have corporate transparency and you have consumers that want to identify themselves with companies and brands that they believe in. And so you see disruption from a company like Warby Parker or Tom's where they're buy one, give one. And those are companies that people want to attach themselves to for that mission and for the product. And I think that's the marriage that you need. You need a great product and a great corporate brand that's going to connect with your consumers. And I think that old companies that aren't innovating and aren't tangible to the modern consumer, they're going to go away and get replaced by modern companies. And those modern companies, a lot of the time, are built on some form of social responsibility.
Okay, so David mentioned, he said 1%, and I can't not think about the 1%. And talk about Thomas Piketty's book. Anybody heard about Thomas Piketty's book? Raise his hands. Okay, so we know what we're talking about. And the reason I'm raising it, that if you read this book, I think 200 pages of this 700 pages book is basically about investments and about compounding interest rates. And basically what Piketty says that because compounding interest is such a powerful way to accumulate wealth, and the return on investment is, in the last 200, 300 years, was higher than the growth of the economies, inequality is about, that the huge inequality that we see today is only going to grow more and more and more. How important do you think this discourse is going to be in the investment world? David's.
It's going to be important.
I think when we saw Occupy Wall Street and we see the fact that there's a backlash. It is very important to recognize it. It is differential in different countries and different parts of the world, very, very much so. The power of compound interest, coming from and spending a lot of time in my life in Philadelphia, Ben Franklin, 200 plus years ago, gave a prize that was the compound interest, and the prize wasn't awarded until 200 years later, which was a few years ago. He put $1. And I think that when the prize was awarded, it was $28,000 or some number like that. And to show the power of compound interest over long periods of time, even at the relatively low 3% kind of average interest rates that prevailed over that couple of hundred-year period. I think that it's not so much the compound interest inequality. I think there are places like Africa, like Latin America, like some parts of the Far East, in the developing world, where the opportunity for the bottom fifth to move up dramatically is critical. Because what's happened here is we've stopped letting the middle class move further up. That's been part of what Piketty's worry is. But we have a large part of the world that can really start to have a much better life. And I think that will, for at least 50 or 60 years, ameliorate the frustrations with the fact that the top is
Okay,
getting...
so we agree that in the emerging markets, we're still going to see the lower ranks of the economy going up. But what's going to happen to the middle class in America? What do you think, David, Jason? Yeah. This is a hot potato, it turns out.
Is this provocative? Is it provocative now?
I think we can go back to the comments earlier about the regulatory environment. And I think that'll have a large impact on things. I think we see it in Texas, where I'm from, that lower regulations allow people to be a little bit more upwardly mobile. They can start their businesses, they can invest in real estate, they can do these types of things from a lower threshold.
Okay, so let's talk about the five giants for a second. Basically, correct me if I'm wrong, many of the startups and the ventures that are founded in the last few years have in their roadmap somewhere being bought by 5 companies. And those 5 huge companies of the internet, each one with a market cap of between 150 to close to $500 billion US dollars. And basically what these 5 companies that we all know who they are, maybe 6, these 5 companies, basically what they're doing is consolidating the monopoly that each one has on a platform or a network. What does it do for the investment world and for the consumers? David.
I'll take a stab. So I think it's always challenging investing in a company that's their goal is to get bought by another company. We try to look at companies that want to do great things, and earlier panel are passionate about it. But I think the increase in sort of platforms that are buying companies is a good thing. I think what's missing in a lot of conversation, we touched on it a little bit with the first panel about why New York, what's happening in New York right now, why is New York so special, is because of the transformation of major industry. We talk a little bit about with hotel and transportation, macro industry. You look at a company like Under Armour buying MapMyFitness, or Chase, we talk about having 6,000 branches, or CPG industry or pharmaceutical industry. I think the next phase of the internet is about the commercialization of the web, and major industry is here. So I think on one end you have the Valley, which are all these platforms that have capital to buy and fuel innovation. On the other hand, it's here now. It's New York is here because it's the application of all this technology. So it's one lens.
I think ideally you don't want a company, you're not funding a company at the early stage who says, I want to be bought by Facebook in 3 years. That's not the investment thesis. I think the biggest change you've actually seen in the past probably 2-3 years is that number of 5 is expanded to somewhere in 500 or 5,000, because every single company needs tech, right? If a company's looking at their future, it's not not tech, right? Every company sees that tech is the only way that they're going to innovate, they're going to modernize, and so you're seeing acquisitions from bigger players that have nothing to do with the early stage ecosystems that we're funding into.
So you think we'll see more acquisition done not by the big five, but rather by companies that are not necessarily...
Absolutely. I mean, even in New York, right, a company like MakerBot, it's not being acquired by, Google or Facebook. You see over and over new acquirers come in to buy a specific piece of technology or a specific movement that they want to buy into. And
Even before we get into acquisition, like just look at what's happening with major industries like willing to work with startups. Like 5 years ago, I get Macy's or Unilever, like get New York, metro companies, they wouldn't even take the meeting. It would go through their agency or however things happen. And now if they don't, there'll be one retailer. It's Amazon. So so it starts with like these folks who not only are they taking meetings, they're calling us to ask to see what's next. So I think it's major transformation of industry coupled with innovation that's happening at the platform level.
I think David Tisch's point is a good one. We had one of our biggest exits was the Climate Corporation bought by Monsanto, which wanted to get a much better big data play in the agriculture space. And it wasn't, even though the founders came out of Google, it wasn't bought by Google as a big data play. It was bought by a company that could use it there. But we certainly, when we look at funding a company, if the entrepreneur has on their slide, and here are my exit possibilities, we're pretty much turned off because we want you to be building a giant company, and the exits will happen when they're ready. Your goal is to build something giant and important.
And you're seeing new platforms potentially emerge, right? Uber is going to start acquiring companies. Pinterest is going to start acquiring companies. There are smaller sub, $20 billion companies that are going to keep growing and become major acquirers, and that's going to increase competition amongst those big five as well.
What kind of any change are you think we're going to see in the structure of the VC world?
We've already seen one. I mean, the VC world has shrunk dramatically. The number of firms has shrunk dramatically because of the post-2000 bubble performance. The funds raised in 2000 did terribly, and some of them returning much less than capital. So we've gone from 1,300 firms to about 500 to 600 firms sort of active and even smaller. And the money has shifted to be barbell. There's a lot of stuff at the very early stage where the three of us play, and there's a lot of money at the private equity and very late stage. And the hard part now is after you've used your $2 million from first round and Box and Metamorphic, then you need to raise 10 million. And where are you going to get that? That 5 to 10 million is getting tougher.
I think you're going to see an emergence of a totally new investor class that doesn't necessarily compete with us, but it's funding different size opportunities, right? Lifestyle businesses is a bad word for it. But the businesses that we see, one of the determinations you have to make is what's the scale here, what's the potential size, and we turn away a lot of businesses that we think are really interesting, but just don't have the potential to scale. Those businesses should be funded. Those businesses should be in market, and there isn't an investor class that's focused on those primarily right now because they get commingled with venture scalable businesses. And I think the most interesting investor opportunity is to focus on those types of businesses. It's going to take a different model than VC or the VC that we see today because the return profile is going to be different. It might be a dividend business and not an acquisition business, but those businesses are lacking investors because nobody's spending time looking for those opportunities. Instead, we have to decide, oh, that's not big enough for us.
It's funny, it's not exactly the point, but I once asked Howard about a company that I really liked, the product, and I asked him if he thought it was a good investor, and he said, that's an uni. I said, what's uni? He said user, not investor. But I think David is 100% right that the productization of the asset class is going to change, and I'm not picking on Hotel Tonight. I love Hotel Tonight, actually. Huge fan, but you saw that Cotu did a big round. And I think we're seeing this advent of large private equity moving downstream. At the same time, companies are moving upstream, and the big platforms are going out to the public markets later. And I don't want to say B-level, but earlier companies are getting out quicker. So I think as the publics and privates get correlated into just good technology companies, and that gets stitched together, there's going to be big changes. And I think even with this huge money coming downstream now, we ask ourselves every day, and we did before we closed our last fund, do we want to be seed investors? Should we be going upstream? And the answer was yes and yes. We want to be seed investors, assuming that we have access to the right deals, but more importantly, we could access distribution, monetization, help entrepreneurs in a different way. So I think the model has to change where, as money gets commoditized, there's different components that entrepreneurs need to execute and build their business. And I think the seed funds and the mid-level funds and the big funds that eventually win, it's going to be more than money that distinguishes them.
Howard, you see a lot of unis around here today, in this time and age?
I see them all the time. I mean, and, I actually have a blog post a few years ago about it, but I see them all the time because they're a business that'll generate 20 million of revenue and 5 million of EBITDA. And if you're the person who owns half of that, that's fantastic. And if you're an investor that owns 10% for the right amount, you can be getting 100% a year return instead of the zero interest rate.
That business should exist. It should be funded, but those businesses naturally come to the venture capitals for funding, and they're not finding it, and that's the problem to me is, if you walk down the street, every one of the old stodgy businesses that occupy retail, they're going to go away, and they're going to be replaced by something modern. That something modern might not be. There's 35 dry cleaning startups in New York City right now. Right, like literally everywhere you go, there's a .com truck driving around, picking up dry cleaning, driving it somewhere and bringing it back. Are those VC businesses? If they build Uber for dry cleaning, yes, but the odds of that happening are minimal, yet dry cleaning should probably get modernized in some form because lugging your clothes around from your house to around the corner just doesn't necessarily make sense. And so that business should be funded, but I'm not funded.
Okay, so we have only 2 minutes to go. In the last 2 minutes, I want each one of you as an ending note to give us a forecast, a projection on any asset class that is different than conventional wisdom. Howard, you start.
I do think that interest rates are going up, and I think that I think they are going to go up.
Wow.
I think QE is going to stop, and we're going to actually start to see a rise in interest rates. So as a result, I think, and again, I've learned years ago about forecasting. Give them a direction, or a time frame or a time, but never both in the same sentence. So I don't know if it's going to be this year or next year, but I do think that's going to happen. But for interest rate products, I've been investing in the crowd fund, in the lending club, in providing the capital to the lending clubs, the on-decks, and providing that capital, you can make a good return.
David.
I think there'll be a massive shift in the way that retail real estate's done. I think that the 10-year leases that you see companies having to sign in the past are going away. You're going to see experimental retail. You're going to see retail that's more experiential to the consumer, and that's going to have a huge impact in the way that cities look, the way that streets look, and the way that the stores that you're walking past feel.
Yeah, I think I'm back to one of my answers before, which is I don't know. I remember I worked at Google for about 8.5 years, and when we bought YouTube, I remember asking Eric, did we pay the right amount? It felt like a lot, and he looked at me like I was crazy, and he said, absolutely not. I said, really? What? That's refreshing. And he said, we either paid too little or we paid too much. Ask me in 5 years. Ironically, last night I went to YouTube's new front, and I think we paid too little. So I don't know. I think there's going to be a lot of transformation that happens. I believe wholeheartedly with David, just talk about retail in general is changing. Back to the Chase example I used, Macy's launched e-commerce functionality in 300 of their stores in 2013 and used real estate as a warehouse now to compete on delivery for things eventually like dry cleaning possibly and food delivery, Amazon. So I think there's a lot of disruption still to happen in traditional real estate meets sort of the web and the transformation of industry.
Jason.
I think you're going to see younger investors moving more to fixed income in their portfolios as there's disruption, and those are opportunities there.
Guys, thank you very much. You've been a brave panel.